On the night of June 9, 1912, in a small, quiet town in the heart of Iowa, a brutal crime unfolded. A crime that would shake the very foundation of the community, send shockwaves across the state, and leave behind a trail of questions that would remain unanswered for over a century. This was not the work of a simple robbery gone wrong. This was something far darker, more sinister, something unimaginable. 8 lives were taken in one brutal, violent night. But perhaps the most chilling part of it all is that to this day, no one knows who did it. Villisca, Iowa, in 1912, was a sleepy little town. With a population of just around 2,000, it was a place where people knew one another by name. Families lived in close-knit communities, and the night was peaceful, punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the occasional passing car or horse-drawn carriage. Life was simple, but that all changed on the evening of June 9th, when the Moore family was slaughtered in their own home. The Moore family consisted of Josiah and Sarah Moore, parents in their 40s, and their 4 children: Herman, 11, Catherine, 10, Boyd, 7, and Paul, just 5. That night, Josiah's children were joined by 2 young guests, Lena and Ina Stillinger, 2 sisters who had been invited to spend the night at the Moore household. It seemed like any other ordinary night, but what transpired in those hours between sunset and sunrise would forever alter the course of Villisca's history. The scene was found early the next morning, when a neighbor, concerned after not seeing the family that day, decided to investigate. What they discovered was horrifying. The bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore were found in their bed, covered by sheets. Their children were murdered in the same gruesome manner. But the real horror was in the Stillinger sisters, Lena and Ina. The 2 girls, only 12 and 8 years old, had been killed alongside the Moore family, their lives snuffed out in the same brutal fashion. They were all found in their beds, blood soaking through the sheets, staining the floors, walls, and even the ceilings of the Moore family's home. The weapon? An axe. The killer had used it to bludgeon each victim in their sleep, crushing skulls and severing life from 8 innocent souls. 8 victims, all murdered in a single night. But what made this crime even more unsettling, what haunted investigators from the start, was the utter lack of evidence. No sign of forced entry, no obvious motive. And perhaps most disturbing of all, no clear explanation as to why this particular family was chosen. Who could do something so horrific? And why had they spared the baby, who was sleeping in the same room as the others? The most haunting question of all, who could possibly be capable of such an act of unimaginable violence? And why was it left unsolved for so long? Villisca was a town that, like so many others, prided itself on its sense of community. The Moore family was well liked. Josiah, a local businessman, ran a dry goods store, and Sarah was a beloved member of the community. Their children, too, were well known around town. They were all considered good, upstanding people. But the brutality of the crime made no sense. How could a killer commit such a violent act without any obvious connection to the family? The authorities were at a loss, and the community was shaken to its core. Sheriff J.B. Phelps and his team rushed to the scene, and what they found was a massacre. The bodies of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters lay in their beds, each with an axe wound to the head, each one gruesomely butchered in the silence of the night. Reports of the crime spread quickly throughout the town. Local residents were horrified, and the news reached neighboring towns in the blink of an eye. Villisca, which had once felt so safe, now felt like a place haunted by an unseen predator. The crime scene offered few clues, nothing that could point toward a suspect, and nothing that could explain why this house, this family, was targeted. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry. The axe, left behind at the scene, told investigators little. It was just an ordinary tool, a household item that anyone could have owned. The killer had clearly planned the attack with a level of precision, but still, there was no clear pattern. There was no break in the case, no leads, only eerie silence. The killer had vanished without a trace. As the days passed, the authorities began to piece together what they could. They discovered that the axe had belonged to the Moore family, and it had been left at the crime scene, almost as if the killer had taken time to clean it off before placing it back where it had been found. The killer had even taken the time to cover the mirrors and windows of the house with sheets, which only deepened the mystery. Why would the murderer go through such lengths to shield themselves from view? Was this a crime of passion, or was it calculated and cold? And then there was the peculiar detail about the Stillinger sisters. They weren't related to the Moores. What drew them into this? Why were they killed along with the family, when they could have been left untouched? After weeks of searching for answers, the case began to grow colder. There were theories, but nothing concrete. No one could understand why or how this had happened, or who the killer was. The case would go on to haunt not only the people of Villisca, but also generations of investigators and true crime enthusiasts. And as the years passed, the name Villisca would become synonymous with unsolved murder and terrifying mystery. The chilling thought that haunted the townspeople, even to this day, is this: the killer was never caught. Who took the lives of the Moore family and the Stillinger sisters? What drove this person to commit such an unspeakable act of violence? Like and subscribe and delve into the investigation, where suspects began to surface and theories began to form. On the morning of June 10, 1912, a quiet town in Iowa would wake to a discovery that would forever change it. In a house that had once been filled with the sounds of laughter and the hustle of everyday life, something far darker was now echoing through its walls. The gruesome crime scene found that morning would raise more questions than answers, and those questions would linger unanswered for generations. It was the early morning hours when Mary Peckham, a neighbor, grew concerned after not seeing the Moore family the previous day. The children usually went to church, but this Sunday they hadn't shown up. The absence was strange, and so, with growing worry, she approached the Moore household. As she knocked on the door and received no answer, Mary's unease turned to dread. She tried the door, and it opened. What she saw inside would haunt her for the rest of her life. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, but the silence was broken by the horrible sight that awaited her in the bedroom. There, in the dim morning light, Mary discovered the bodies of Josiah and Sarah Moore, their lifeless forms lying in their bed, covered in blood, their faces twisted by the horror they had endured in their final moments. In the children's room, the scene was just as horrific. Herman, Catherine Boyd, and Paul Moore, each of them struck down in their sleep, their bodies contorted in grotesque, unnatural positions. And in the guest room, the Stillinger sisters, Lena, 12, and Ina, just 8, lay in the same blood-soaked silence. But the horror did not end there. No, the scene was more than just a massacre. It was a scene of deliberate, calculated brutality. The killer had not only killed each victim with an axe, but had also taken the time to cover their faces with bedclothes. This disturbing detail suggested something chilling, an effort to hide the victims from sight. Why? Was the killer trying to preserve a sense of peace in the aftermath of such carnage, or was this a twisted act of control? The beds were drenched in blood, but the killer seemed to take particular care in placing the sheets over the bodies, as though intending to hide the violence he had just inflicted. It became apparent that this was not a random act of violence. The killer had carefully selected his victims, one by one, bludgeoning them with the axe as they slept. The violence was unrelenting and brutal, each blow calculated and savage. No one had heard a thing, not even the youngest child, Paul, who was just 5 years old. But what makes this crime scene so much more perplexing and chilling are the strange details that followed. There was something off about the house, something almost ritualistic. The windows had been covered with sheets and the curtains drawn tight. Some suggested that the killer had spent time inside the house, hiding in the shadows after the murders were committed, waiting for the perfect moment to escape. The killer's actions didn't stop with the murders themselves. When the authorities arrived, they discovered more peculiarities. The axe that had been used in the killings was found in the house. It was the Moore family's own axe, and it was covered in blood, though it had been wiped clean. The weapon left behind at the scene was almost like a signature. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no indication that the killer had to struggle to get inside. The front door was unlocked. It was as though the killer had been allowed in or had known the family well enough to not need to break in. It wasn't just the physical evidence that stood out. The atmosphere in the house seemed to reflect something unnatural. In the upstairs bedroom, where the bodies were found, there was a peculiar detail. The mirrors were covered. This wasn't just an act of a murderer who didn't want to be seen. It was an act of control. Why cover the mirrors? What did the killer want to hide from his own reflection? Was this a psychological choice? A display of shame, or perhaps a symbol of something deeper, something more sinister? Then there was the question of the killer's timing. After killing the Moore family and the Stillinger girls, the murderer didn't flee immediately. The house had been locked up tight when police arrived. In fact, it was as though the killer had lingered after the murders, perhaps contemplating the next move, perhaps even relishing in the aftermath of such a heinous crime. Detectives, once they arrived on the scene, were at a loss. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence left behind by the killer. The weapon was just an ordinary household tool, and yet it had become the instrument of death for 8 people. The killer, whoever he was, had moved through the house with an almost unnatural calm, killing each person one by one, before covering them in their own blood and leaving without a trace. The crime scene was a puzzle. Nothing fit. No one could explain why the Moore family was targeted or why the Stillinger sisters were also killed. There was no motive, no obvious connection between the victims and the murderer. The scene itself was disturbing, almost ritualistic, yet the killer had left no marks of his identity. He was a ghost slipping in and out of the house undetected, a shadow that no one saw coming. As the investigation continued, the mystery deepened. But the haunting question still remained. Who did this? And why? The Villisca axe murders had become more than just a horrific crime. They had become an enigma, a chilling, unsolved mystery that would linger in the hearts of the townspeople for decades. And as the investigation began, the answers seemed more elusive than ever. But what followed in the coming days would change everything. Let's take a deep look into the initial investigation, the evidence or lack thereof, and the detectives' pursuit of clues. When a crime like the Villisca axe murders occurs, the authorities are expected to piece together the shattered fragments of evidence and make sense of a grotesque and seemingly senseless act. But with each passing hour, the investigation only seemed to deepen the mystery surrounding the brutal deaths of 8 people in that small Iowa town. The crime scene had left more questions than answers, and despite the authorities' best efforts, no clear path to the killer had emerged. Days passed, then weeks, and yet the chilling question still lingered. Who could do such a thing? Sheriff J.B. Phelps and his team arrived on the scene as soon as the crime was discovered. They were faced with an overwhelming task: to find a killer who had committed an act of such cruelty, yet left behind so few clues. The scene appeared to be meticulously staged, the mirrors covered, the windows shut, and not a single sign of forced entry. The killer had left behind only a blood-stained axe. But as investigators scoured the house for evidence, they found little to help them understand the motivations behind such a brutal act. Initial theories about the crime ranged from a botched robbery to a crime of passion. However, neither seemed to fit the grisly details of the case. Robbery was quickly ruled out. Nothing of value had been taken from the house. No jewelry, no money. The killer hadn't even seemed interested in stealing anything. The Moore family's home was not a place of riches. No, this was not a robbery. And it wasn't just a random act of violence, either. The killer had taken the time to methodically execute each victim while they slept, almost as if this was part of a plan. No one could understand why the Moore family was targeted or why the 2 young Stillinger girls had been brought into the mix. The investigation seemed to be unraveling in every direction, but each lead faded away just as quickly as it appeared. As the investigation began, there were a number of potential suspects, each of them raising more questions than answers. One of the first theories that emerged involved the possibility of a transient. Several individuals who were passing through Villisca in the days before the murders were questioned. One of them was a man named Frank Jones, a local businessman who had a strained relationship with Josiah Moore. Some believed Jones had a motive related to a business rivalry, but there was no hard evidence linking him to the crime. Then there was the strange case of Reverend George Kelly. Kelly had been in Villisca the night of the murders, staying at a nearby boarding house. The Reverend was questioned after the sheriff learned that Kelly had a history of mental instability and had exhibited strange behavior around the time of the murders. Kelly had allegedly been seen lurking around the area earlier that evening, and some believed he might have had a motive to harm the Moore family. He was also reported to have had strange conversations with other residents of Villisca. But once again, there was no direct evidence to tie him to the crime. The investigation seemed to be going in circles, with one suspect after another falling apart under scrutiny. Amidst the confusion and lack of solid leads, the sheriff and his team began to focus on other peculiarities at the crime scene. One piece of evidence stood out above the rest. An empty bowl of water was found in the kitchen. This small detail raised more questions. Why had the killer stopped to wash their hands in the middle of such a violent act? Was the killer so calm that they felt no urgency, even after committing such a heinous crime? Was the killer intentionally trying to leave as few traces as possible, even cleaning off their hands before leaving? Investigators were left with little but theories and fragments of clues. As the days turned into weeks, the initial shock of the crime began to wear off, but the sense of fear remained. Villisca was a town that had never known such violence, and the residents now lived with the unnerving fear that the killer could still be among them. But just as the case began to grow colder, the most peculiar theory of all emerged, a theory that would cast doubt on the very premise of the investigation itself. Some locals began to believe that the killer might have been a person who knew the Moore family well, someone who had a close connection to the house. But as more evidence came to light, the case only seemed to get more confusing. There were no concrete leads, no fingerprints, no obvious connection between the victims and any of the suspects. Was it possible that the killer had been someone from outside of Villisca, someone who was simply passing through? Or was the killer someone who had been familiar with the Moore family, someone they knew well enough to trust? With each passing day, the investigation seemed to grind to a halt. No witnesses, no confession, and no solid evidence pointing to a killer. The case was slipping further into the realm of cold cases, with only whispers of suspicion and unsubstantiated theories to keep it alive. But in the coming weeks, there would be a shocking twist. A twist that would introduce a new suspect, one who was previously overlooked, and who would forever change the way people viewed the Villisca axe murders. The investigation had only just begun, and the true horror of the Villisca axe murders was still waiting to be uncovered. Who was the killer? Was the answer right in front of them, hidden behind the fog of fear and confusion? Let's now delve deeper into the chilling leads that surfaced, the new suspects that emerged, and the shocking conclusion that would leave everyone questioning everything they thought they knew about the case. As the investigation into the Villisca axe murders continued, the mystery only deepened. With no concrete evidence, no confessions, and no clear motive, the case began to take on a life of its own. Theories about who could have committed such a brutal crime began to spread throughout Villisca and beyond. Each theory seemed more perplexing than the last, and each suspect brought even more questions than answers. What began as a murder investigation soon became a web of suspicion, as the town's darkest secrets began to surface. At the heart of the investigation were several key suspects, each with their own set of motives, and each one bringing with them a new piece to the puzzle. But no one theory seemed to fit. The more investigators dug, the more elusive the killer became. Let's begin with the most obvious and most talked about suspect, Frank Jones. Frank was a prominent local businessman and a former state senator, and he had a bitter feud with Josiah Moore, the father of the family. Some believed that this rivalry could have driven Frank to murder. The two men had clashed over business deals in the past. Josiah had allegedly attempted to poach some of Jones' employees, and their relationship had soured. This bitter rivalry was enough to make some people think Frank Jones might have had a motive to kill Josiah, and perhaps the entire family, as a way to eliminate a business rival. Jones' alibi was solid. He was in another town the night of the murders, and there was no physical evidence to place him at the Moore home. Some even speculated that Jones' motive might have been tied to a romantic affair with Sarah Moore, but once again, this was just speculation. There was no concrete proof. Despite this, the idea that Jones was the killer persisted in the town's rumors. But as the weeks turned into months, the investigation turned to other possible suspects. The next suspect to emerge was Reverend George Kelly, a traveling preacher who had been in Villisca on the night of the murders. Kelly was an odd character, a man with a history of mental instability and bizarre behavior. He had been staying in a nearby boarding house the night of the killings and was known to have been acting strangely in the days leading up to the murders. Kelly had been seen walking near the Moore house the evening before the murders, and he had reportedly made several odd comments to locals, hinting at violent tendencies. Some believed that Kelly's mental state could have made him capable of such a horrific crime. But once again, there was no solid evidence to connect him to the murders. His alibi seemed to check out, and no one could definitively prove he had been near the Moore house that night. Despite the lack of evidence, Kelly's strange behavior had many wondering if he was the killer. Some theorized that the preacher might have been driven by some twisted religious fervor or a desire for vengeance. But still, there was nothing concrete to hold him as a suspect. As the investigation continued, new theories began to emerge, some even more chilling than the last. One of the most disturbing possibilities was that the killer was a stranger who had passed through Villisca that night. Someone who had no connection to the Moore family, but who knew the layout of the house well enough to enter undetected. This theory was fueled by reports of a man who had been seen walking around the town in the days leading up to the murders, someone who didn't seem to fit in with the rest of the locals. Could this mysterious stranger have been the killer? Was he someone who simply picked the Moore house at random? Or was this a carefully planned attack? Local residents had reported seeing a man who fit this description, but no one knew who he was. No one could place him in town, and no one could remember his name. As time went on, this theory seemed to gain traction, especially since there were no signs of forced entry. If the killer was a stranger, how had he managed to slip past the family undetected? The lack of any clear clues made this theory even more chilling. The idea that the killer had simply wandered into the house, committed the murders, and then disappeared into the night was almost more terrifying than the possibility of a personal motive. But the strangest theory of all was one that had less to do with a human killer and more to do with something far more supernatural. Some of the townsfolk, haunted by the brutality of the crime, began to whisper that the Moore family had been cursed. Villisca had a history of tragedy and death, and some began to believe that the house itself might have been a magnet for evil. Was it possible that the murders were part of a long-standing curse? In fact, rumors began to circulate that the town had witnessed strange events before, unsolved disappearances, unexplained deaths, and some began to connect these events with the dark history of Villisca itself. Were these crimes the result of something far more sinister than a human killer? Was there something malevolent at work in the town that had driven the killer to commit such a horrific act? This theory was as unsettling as it was irrational. But in the wake of such horrific violence, the mind has a way of searching for something more, a deeper explanation, something that makes sense of the chaos. Could the Villisca axe murders have been part of a darker, more supernatural force? Or was the killer simply a person who had chosen to act on their own dark impulses? As the weeks went by, no answers came. Theories swirled. Suspects came and went. And the people of Villisca grew more desperate for closure. Yet, despite all the theories, the case remained unsolved. With each passing day, the shadows of doubt grew longer, and the fear that the killer could be hiding in plain sight became more palpable. Theories would come and go. Suspects would continue to be questioned. But the Villisca axe murders would remain one of the most puzzling and horrific unsolved crimes in American history. And as we continue this investigation, we will delve deeper into the final chilling twist of this case, the one that would forever leave us questioning the true identity of the killer. As the weeks passed, the investigation into the Villisca axe murders seemed to lose steam. The initial shock had worn off, and the haunting specter of the crime began to fade from the town's immediate consciousness. The suspects had all been investigated, and the theories had been exhausted. But the most chilling part of the entire ordeal was not that the case remained unsolved, but that, in the face of all the uncertainty, the investigation seemed to be slipping into oblivion. The town of Villisca was never the same. What had once been a quiet, tight-knit community was now filled with whispers of fear, doubt, and suspicion. The Moore family's murders were a haunting scar on the town's history, a tragedy that no one could seem to make sense of. Yet, despite the collective grief and anxiety, the investigation slowed to a crawl. It wasn't long before the local authorities, with no new leads and no significant progress, began to move on to other matters. The sheriff's office, after months of pursuing leads, had very little to show for their efforts. They had questioned multiple suspects, examined every piece of evidence, and followed up on every tip, but nothing concrete had emerged. As time wore on, many began to question if the killer would ever be caught. Theories that had once seemed plausible now seemed far-fetched. The once hopeful investigation was now a collection of cold leads and dead ends. It became clear that the killer, whoever they were, had left no trace. There were no fingerprints, no footprints, no fibers. No real evidence pointing to any one person. As the investigation stalled, the authorities began to shift their focus elsewhere. Sheriff J.B. Phelps, who had been at the forefront of the case, was replaced by other officers with less personal investment in the case. Local newspapers, once eager to report new developments, began to pull away from the story. The case, which had once captivated the entire nation, began to fade into the background, becoming just another cold case in the long history of unsolved crimes. By the end of 1912, less than a year after the murders, the case was labeled a cold case. No new leads had been found, and no fresh evidence had surfaced. Despite the public's lingering fears, the investigation was put on hold. And with each passing year, the hope of finding the killer grew more and more unlikely. The killer seemed to have vanished, leaving behind only shattered lives and unanswered questions. Over time, the Villisca axe murders would become a story whispered about in hushed tones, a tale of unspeakable horror that would linger in the back of people's minds for decades. But it was a mystery that no one had the answers to. As years turned to decades, the case of the Villisca axe murders became a chilling symbol of unresolved violence. While many tried to uncover the truth, researchers, armchair detectives, even amateur historians, the case remained an enigma. And it wasn't just the lack of answers that haunted the town of Villisca. It was the idea that someone, somewhere, knew what had happened that night, but had never been brought to justice. In the years following the murders, there were sporadic attempts to reopen the case. New theories arose. New suspects were named. Some people even claimed to have had dreams or visions of the killer's identity, but none of this led to anything substantial. The idea that the killer was still out there, living among the residents of Villisca, or perhaps hiding elsewhere, was enough to keep the public interested in the story, but it also kept them in a constant state of unease. There were those who believed that the killer was a figure who had eluded detection for years, or perhaps someone with ties to Villisca, who had hidden their true identity under a cloak of secrecy. Could the killer have been someone who was never suspected? Someone who had blended into the fabric of daily life? The killer might have been a respected member of society, a person who was able to walk among the townspeople, unchallenged and undetected. Even now, over a century later, the Villisca axe murders remain one of the most haunting, unsolved crimes in American history. The house where the murders took place still stands today, preserved as a macabre museum for those curious enough to visit. But the questions surrounding that dark night have never been answered. Who killed the Moore family and the two young Stillinger girls? And why did they commit such a horrific crime? Perhaps the answers will never come. Perhaps the killer was someone who was forgotten by time, slipping through the cracks of history, leaving nothing but fear and uncertainty in their wake. Or perhaps, somewhere, hidden within the fog of the past, there lies a clue, waiting to be discovered. But for now, the Villisca Axe murders remain an enigma, a tragedy that has never been fully understood, a mystery that continues to haunt the hearts of those who have followed it. Sad face. Though the investigation into the Villisca Axe murders may have stagnated, the case has never been forgotten. Over the years, as the wounds of the past began to heal in the town of Villisca, the story of that horrific night continued to haunt the town's collective memory. It was not the end of the story. Far from it. The mystery surrounding the murders, the unanswered questions, and the unsolved case became a source of dark intrigue for many, a haunting reminder of a violent, bloody night that was never truly explained. The murders of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls have become one of the most notorious unsolved crimes in American history. Every year, people from all walks of life travel to Villisca, Iowa, to stand outside the house where it all happened. Some come to pay respects, others come to try to uncover new clues, and some simply come for the thrill of exploring the infamous crime scene. The Villisca Axe Murder House, now a museum, has become a pilgrimage site for those captivated by the mystery. The house has been preserved as it was the night of the murders, with the furniture and belongings left largely intact. The chilling silence that fills the house only adds to the eeriness. Over the years, it has been reported that visitors have experienced strange occurrences inside the house, things that seem inexplicable. Cold spots, whispers in the dark, and the feeling of being watched. Some claim to have felt the presence of spirits, lingering long after the gruesome events that took place there. Could it be that the souls of the Moore family and the Stillinger girls still haunt this house? Or is it the energy of that terrible night that lingers, forever trapped within the walls of the house? While some dismiss these experiences as mere superstition or the product of an overactive imagination, others are convinced that something more sinister is at play. The house's dark history has become part of its allure. It draws those seeking answers, those hoping to uncover something that the authorities could not, something that might finally solve the mystery of the Villisca Axe murders. The case of the Villisca Axe murders has not only persisted in the public's memory, but has evolved into a legend, one that captures the imagination of true crime enthusiasts, amateur sleuths, and armchair detectives. Over the years, countless documentaries, books, articles, and podcasts have been dedicated to the case. Each new theory, each fresh set of evidence, or each interpretation of existing facts offers new hope that the mystery will one day be solved. Even today, the theories continue to evolve. Some claim that new evidence, buried in old files or discovered in unexpected places, could lead to the killer's identity. Others believe that there may still be a living person with information that could crack the case wide open. The story of Villisca and the Moore family's brutal murders has become a part of American folklore, a story that refuses to die. While the authorities have long since closed the case, there are those who refuse to let it go. In recent years, a small but passionate group of investigators and enthusiasts have dedicated themselves to finding new clues. Modern forensic technology, including DNA analysis and re-examination of old evidence, has breathed new life into cold cases like Villisca. Could this technology finally provide the breakthrough that was once thought impossible? Beyond the investigative efforts, the Villisca Axe murders have seeped into the cultural consciousness of America. It has inspired fictional works, television shows, and even movies. The chilling atmosphere of the case, the brutality of the murders, the unresolved nature of the crime, has proven to be a compelling narrative, one that taps into our collective fear of the unknown. It's the fear of an unsolved crime that lingers. The idea that there could be someone even now walking among us who knows what happened that night in 1912. The idea that justice was never served. That, for all the investigations, the suspects, and the theories, the killer was never found. And so, as the years continue to pass, the case of the Villisca Axe murders remains open, perhaps not in the eyes of the law, but in the hearts and minds of those who cannot forget it. The case endures as a mystery that may never be solved, yet will never be forgotten. It serves as a reminder that not all questions have answers, and that some horrors may never be fully understood. Perhaps the Villisca Axe murders will always remain a mystery. Perhaps the killer's identity will always be hidden, lurking in the shadows of the past. But one thing is certain, the legacy of that night and the questions it raised will continue to haunt us for generations to come. The Villisca Axe murders remain one of the most enduring and perplexing cases in the history of American crime. Despite over a century of theories, investigations, and speculation, the question still lingers. Who was the killer, and why did they commit such a horrific crime? We've explored the facts, the strange details, the mysterious suspects, and the chilling crime scene. We've examined the theories that have emerged over the years, ranging from personal vendettas to supernatural explanations. And still, the case remains unsolved. The killer never caught. The motive never fully understood. Over the years, many investigators have looked for answers. Some have scoured the dusty old files, while others have gone straight to the house itself, hoping to uncover new evidence. Yet the truth has remained elusive, as though the killer is still hiding in plain sight, watching from the shadows. While the theory of Frank Jones as the killer, a man with a vendetta against Josiah Moore, seems the most plausible to some, the lack of solid evidence makes it difficult to hold him responsible. Was it really personal, or was there a more sinister, unknown reason for the killings? Jones was a man of power and influence, and yet his alibi remained unshaken. Then there was Reverend George Kelly, whose bizarre behavior and possible mental instability made him a prime suspect. But once again, there was no hard proof linking him to the scene. His odd behavior could have been a mere coincidence, and though his strange past stirred suspicions, he never confessed, and no evidence ever emerged that could definitively place him at the crime scene. And yet, there's one more theory, one that has persisted in the shadows. Could the killer have been a complete stranger, someone passing through Villisca that night? Someone who had no personal connection to the Moore family, but chose the house at random? It's a terrifying thought, that the killer could have simply walked in, murdered without warning, and vanished, never to be seen again. If it were a stranger, the absence of motive becomes even more chilling. What could drive someone to commit such a brutal act with no clear reason, no personal connection? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the shadows of history. The house where the Moore family lived, where they died, has become a symbol, not just of murder, but of a haunting question that remains unanswered. And for those who have studied the case, perhaps the final answer is something we have yet to uncover, a piece of evidence that still sits, waiting to be found. The Villisca Axe murders continue to haunt us, even though the case has long since gone cold. The killer, whoever they were, may never be known. The motive, whatever it may have been, will never be fully understood. But as long as the house stands, and as long as people continue to seek answers, the mystery will remain alive. In the end, the Villisca Axe murders are a reminder that some cases are simply too complex, too elusive, and too mysterious to ever be solved. The killer's identity remains one of America's greatest unsolved mysteries, a story that will continue to echo in the minds of those who dare to explore it.